In a land where hope had seemingly died and only the dust endured, Thorne McCrae ruled a kingdom of silence and loss. His heart, as calloused as his own dying ranch, knew only two things: the ache of grief and meals that were impossible to swallow. He posted for a cook, expecting another rough-hewn man who could stomach the hardship, but fate answered with a strange wind. A slender woman, carrying a newborn child, stepped out of the shimmering heat mirage. She carried nothing but determination in her eyes and a past with no name. Could she plant a seed of life in this parched earth, or would she, too, be swallowed whole by its unforgiving nature? The thud of a spoon against wood was a dry, final sound, followed by a low, guttural growl. "Damn it, Thorne, even the coyotes would spit this out," Jed, one of the oldest ranch hands, grumbled. His wiry frame leaned over the long table as he pointed at the slop in his bowl with undisguised disgust. "Tastes like someone stewed shoe leather in river mud." A ripple of laughter went down the line, but it was a brittle, strained sound, wrung out from long days under a scorching sun and the endless monotony of dust and disappointment. A younger man slammed a dented pot on the table with a jarring clang. "We work all day, and this is what we get?" In the sudden silence that followed, the click of boots on floorboards announced Thorne McCrae's entrance. Broad-shouldered, sun-weathered, a man carved from the same harsh land he ruled. He paused only a second before his voice, low and steady, cut through the tension. "Anyone thinks they can do better," he said. "The stove's gone cold. Feel free to light it yourselves." No one moved. His gaze swept over them like a bitter north wind across the prairie. "Then shut up and eat." He turned on his heel, the door slamming behind him like a final judgment, leaving no room for argument. Outside, the wind carried the scent of dust and cattle. The sky stretched on forever, a blistering, merciless blue, utterly cloudless. It was the same sky he had buried his wife under 2 years ago. In the solitude of his house, more a fortress than a home, Thorne lit a lantern and sat at the wooden desk that hadn't seen paper or ink in weeks. Across from him, framed by glass, hazy from 1,000 touches, was her photo, Clara. Her smile had been the only soft thing in his life. Since her death, the world had turned harder, louder, and at the same time, unbearably quiet. He pulled open a drawer, took out a sheet of paper, dipped the nib of a pen into ink, and began to write in blocky, practical strokes. Number 1. Cook wanted. Capable of preparing meals for 15 men. Must endure hard work, long hours, and hot kitchens. Room and board provided. Pay negotiable. Apply in person at the McCrae Ranch, north of Yellow Horn. He paused, then underlined the words "in person." No need for letters. No need for foolish dreams. The notice said nothing about gender. He figured no woman would bother. That world was long gone. A week later, dust rolled in waves across the Texas Panhandle, rising from the scorched earth like the ghosts of lost seasons. Heat shimmered across the prairie as the front gate creaked open on rusted hinges. The ranch dogs barked, alerting the men fixing a nearby fence. Thorne stepped out of the barn, wiping sweat from his brow, and then he saw her, a woman, small and slight, her sun-bleached bonnet barely holding back the strands of hair whipped by the wind. She clutched a newborn infant to her chest, wrapped in worn linen. Her dress was stained with the road, her boots were cracked with age, and her eyes, a steady, quiet green like moss on a river stone, met his with a silent force. "I saw your notice," she said before he could speak. "I can cook. I need a place to stay." Thorne blinked. "You walked here?" "Came by wagon, but had to leave it at the fork when the wheel broke. It's just me and the boy now." She glanced down at the baby. "Eliza, that's my name." He studied her for a long time, his jaw clenched tight. "I wasn't expecting a woman." "I figured," she answered evenly. "But food is still food, and a hungry mouth doesn't care who lit the fire." The hands had gathered in loose knots behind him now, whispering and watching. One chuckled. Another muttered, "A woman and a babe." She didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for wages, not yet. Just shelter, food, and a place for my son to sleep." He could have said no. He should have. But something in the steadiness of her stance, despite the burden she carried, despite the sunburn on her cheeks and the dirt on her hem, stilled him. "You cook," he said finally, his voice rough. "Tonight. If there isn't a mutiny by sunrise, the job is yours." She nodded. "That's a fair deal." As she stepped across the threshold of the McCrae ranch, the child nestled against her chest, let out a soft, sleeping sigh. It was the sound of breath, and perhaps, though Thorne could not know it yet, it was the sound of life returning to a place long thought barren. He didn't know her story, and she didn't know his. But something unseen passed between them in that heat-struck yard. He had posted for a cook. What arrived was something else entirely. The kitchen was merely a lean-to, built against the side of the main house, its beams scarred with smoke and warped by time. The shelves were as bare as a prayer in a drought. Eliza stepped into it, holding baby Leo, with a quiet determination in her eyes. She settled her son, still swaddled tight, into an old wooden crate lined with folded flour sacks. The baby gurgled once, then drifted off, unfazed by the clatter of pots or the dry rasp of kindling being split. Eliza moved with purpose. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She found leftover flour, tins of beans sealed with wax, and from those humble offerings she conjured something warm and filling. By sundown, the men had gathered, arms crossed, heads cocked in suspicion. Most of them expected disaster. What they got was golden cornbread, thick with the sweetness of molasses, a bean stew that tasted of smoke and spice, and thin slices of salt pork crisped just right. Jed, the sharp-tongued cowhand, took a bite and paused mid-chew. "Good God, woman, what is this?" He growled. Eliza looked up from where she was ladling stew into a bowl. "Dinner, sir," Jed grunted, but kept chewing. "Tastes like something I'd pay 5 cents for in El Paso," he muttered. Then, without another word, he cleaned his plate, leaving not a single crumb behind. Thorne stood at the edge of the mess hall, arms folded, leaning against the doorframe. He hadn't said a word since she'd stepped into the kitchen, nor had he offered help, but he had watched, closely. He watched as Eliza used a frayed scrap of cloth to tie back her hair, watched as she moved the baby's crate closer to the stove for warmth, watched as she stirred a pot with one hand while the other gently rocked her son. She never raised her voice, never asked for help, never let the exhaustion show on her face. Later that night, the moon had risen, cold and clear, and the men had long gone to their bunks when Thorne stepped out to check on the paddock. He saw a faint glow of a fire behind the kitchen window. He moved closer. Through the warped glass he saw her. Eliza was barefoot, kneeling before the hearth, coaxing a flame from the dying coals. Her son slept soundly on a pile of grain sacks nearby. The air outside was freezing, but inside she moved slowly, carefully, tucking her skirt beneath her knees as she added wood. The fire flared to life, licking at the darkness, casting an orange glow across her face. Then she did something that stopped him cold. She pulled a tin from her satchel, a small dented container wrapped in cloth. From it, she took a few dried leaves and dropped them into a kettle. A few moments later, the scent of chamomile drifted into the cold air. She poured it into an earthen bowl, placed it on a tray, and turned toward the door. Thorne stepped back just as she opened it. There. Eyes met. "I heard you coughing," she said softly. "The dry air, the cold wind. I figured it couldn't hurt." She held out the tray like an offering. He didn't take it, not at first. He just looked at her, this strange, stubborn woman with a child and a quiet fire in her eyes. Then he gave a single sharp nod. She left the tray by the door and disappeared. Back inside, he only picked it up after the door had closed. The tea was warm, slightly bitter, and soothing. He drank all of it. The next morning, when Eliza entered the kitchen, the bowl was washed and placed neatly on the counter. She smiled, just barely. The fire had caught. The Texas wind kicked dust across the ranch yard as Thorne McCrae stepped out of the barn and caught sight of something unusual behind the cattle pens. He narrowed his eyes. There, in a narrow strip of earth where nothing usually grew but scrub and old dung, were 3 small patches of green. Not weeds, they were cultivated. He walked closer, slow and silent, and crouched beside the plants. He recognized mint, faintly aromatic even in the sun. Wild daisies, too, tough and resilient. And another leaf he did not know, broad and dark-veined, as if it belonged in the high mountains rather than here. A small wooden marker, inscribed with delicate script. Read, Boneset. He straightened and turned. Just as Eliza emerged from behind the tack shed, a basket in one hand, baby Leo sleeping in the wrap against her front. She didn't flinch when she saw him, just paused, one brow raised. "They don't take up much room," she said. "I didn't say a word," Thorne replied. "You didn't have to." He studied her a long moment. "You plant them for tea?" "Tea, fevers, upset stomachs, coughs. You're not just a cook." "No," she said plainly, then walked past him, her basket swinging. Her bare feet silent on the packed dirt. Later that week, near dusk, a boy no older than 13 came stumbling across the yard. His name was Finn, one of the newer hands. Eager to prove himself and too green to know what not to chew on while mending a fence. He collapsed near the water trough, pale as ash, vomiting into the dirt. The men panicked. Thorne barked for someone to fetch the doctor in Yellow Horn. At least 2 hours away by fast horse. Eliza arrived seconds later, still dusted in flour, Leo slung over her back. She knelt beside the boy, placed her fingers on his pulse, then leaned close to smell his breath. "Wolfsbane root," she murmured. "He's eaten it. Is he dying?" One of the men asked, his voice cracking. "Not if I act now," she said. She handed the baby to Thorne without asking, and he took the child. On instinct, stunned, she sprinted back to the kitchen, emerging with a jar of yellowish root, a cloth pouch, and a teacup. She boiled water on the stove as the sun sank lower, steam rising like prayers. She mashed the root with a spoon, added mint, then dripped the mixture into Finn's mouth, drop by trembling drop. The men watched in silence, hats in hand. Some crossed themselves. One mumbled a prayer. 30 minutes later, Finn's breathing steadied. By morning, he could sit up and drink broth. The story spread like wildfire. Eliza had saved him. By lunch, the men no longer called her that cook. She was Miss Eliza. One even tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am," as if she were born to high station. That evening, Thorne stood on the porch, watching her sort herbs into small muslin bags, her baby cooing softly in a cradle nearby. The horizon was bathed in gold, the cattle lowing gently in the distance. He approached and leaned against the rail beside her. "You know what you're doing," he said. "I wouldn't still be here if I didn't." "Did you study medicine?" Eliza shook her head. "I learned to survive," Thorne nodded. "But that boy would be dead without you." She was quiet a moment, then said, "My grandmother was Cherokee. She said the earth gives you both the cure and the poison. You just have to know where to look." Thorne ran a hand along the porch post. He didn't ask any more questions, just stood with her as dusk wrapped around them like a soft blanket, her herbs rustling in their pouches, his hands in his pockets. The air was quiet, except for the occasional hum of night insects, and for the first time in a long time, Thorne McCrae did not feel the need to speak, nor the burden of filling the silence. He just listened. Things changed quietly, like the slow shifting of seasons when no one is watching. The men at McCrae Ranch stopped slamming doors and started wiping their boots before entering the cookhouse. They took off their hats when they were near the baby. Someone fixed the loose porch board without being asked, and every evening, without fail, there was hot cornbread on the long table, sliced and buttered with care, alongside a pot of herbal tea that soothed the day's grit from their throats. Thorne McCrae watched it all happen without comment. He noticed how Eliza moved through the house as if she belonged there, though she never claimed any space as hers. He noticed how she always placed a cup of tea outside his door when his cough returned on colder nights. He noticed the sound of her laughter, rare but real, which sounded like water running over stones when one of the men said something foolish at dinner. He began rising earlier, not because he had to, but because he wanted to beat the sun and make repairs on the old kitchen shack before she woke. The door had been hanging crooked for years. Now it swung true. The cracked window frame now held fresh glass. He rebuilt the broken step with care, sanding the edges so she wouldn't trip when holding the baby. He never said a word about the work, but each board he nailed, each hinge he oiled, was a kind of apology and a thank you. One night, the wind howled harder than usual, dry and sharp as if it held knives. Eliza couldn't sleep. Baby Leo stirred restlessly, then settled back into dreams with a little sigh. She wrapped herself in a shawl and walked quietly through the house, past the quiet creak of sleeping wood, until she reached the barn. There, in the dim light of a single oil lamp, sat Thorne. He was alone, his legs stretched out in front of him, an old guitar across his lap. The thing looked worn, weathered like a driftwood cross, its strings dulled, its body dusty, its tuning pegs loose. But his hands moved over it like someone reacquainting himself with a lover thought lost. He didn't notice her at first. His head was bowed, his fingers plucking a hesitant melody, rough, halting. The tune faltered, then steadied, something half remembered. And aching Eliza stepped forward, slowly, not wanting to startle him. When he looked up, surprised, she did not speak. Instead, she walked over and sat on a low wooden crate beside him. Her shawl slipped slightly, revealing her collarbone, the curve of her neck in the soft light. She looked at the guitar. "I haven't heard music like that in a long time," she said quietly. Thorne swallowed. "Used to play every night when Clara was alive." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Music made this place feel like a home, not a prison. I stopped touching it the day we buried her." Eliza's eyes softened. She reached out and placed her hand gently on the strings. "You know," she said, her voice low, "music isn't a sin. Living without it is." He looked at her, searching her face for mockery, for pity. There was none. Just understanding. Outside, the wind screamed past the eaves, kicking dust across the yard. But inside that barn, all was still. He strummed a single clear note, and it lingered. Eliza leaned her head against the wall behind them, her eyes closed. Thorne didn't say another word. He simply played. And in the quiet between the notes, something buried long ago began to stir. It began like a whisper. Just a few patches of brittle grass turning gray, then yellow, then curling to ash beneath the heat. Within days, the western pastures looked scorched, even though the sky had dropped no fire. Then came the coughing. The herd grew lethargic, their eyes dull, their movements sluggish. Some limped, others refused to eat. One morning, a young steer collapsed at the watering hole, foam crusting its mouth. Thorne ordered it shot and buried, hoping it was a one-off. It WASN single quotesy. By the end of the week, 6 more were dead. 30 were sick. And the grass, once the color of fresh-cut hay, now looked like grave shrouds spread across the fields. Thorne stood in the corral at dusk, his hat off, dust on his hands, staring at the horizon as if it might offer an answer. It didn't. The doctor from Yellow Horn came, sniffed around, shrugged. and offered nothing but guesswork. This land is cursed. One of the cowhands muttered. Thorne didn't reply. His jaw was set tight enough to crack. That night, Eliza didn't come to supper. Instead, she crouched by the fence line, running her fingers through a cow's manure, examining the color and texture with a focus that made the others uneasy. She quietly called Thorne over. "This isn't a natural sickness," she said. "It's what they ate." "Poisoned?" he asked, his voice tight. "Not exactly. There's a plant, milkweed. It looks like a normal leaf when it sprouts. Cattle will eat it if the real grass dies off." She lifted the cow's lip. Inside, ulcers bloomed like rot. She rose. "I've seen this before. My grandmother treated a herd up in Cherokee country when I was 10. He didn't ask any more questions, just nodded once, and she disappeared. Into the woods with a basket and a knife. For 2 days, Eliza worked from sunup to well past moonrise. She boiled bark down to a pulp. She crushed dried papaya leaves into powder. She mixed ash from mesquite logs into a thick brown paste. She sang softly under her breath as she worked, half lullaby, half memory. Baby Leo slept beside her, wrapped, snug in a feed sack turned cradle. Then she fed the remedy by hand to every sick animal, one by one, with Thorne holding their heads still. She pressed the thick mixture between their teeth, massaging their throats to force it down. Some resisted. Some spat, some vomited. But some, more than expected, stood up the next day with steadier legs. And by the end of the week, while news came in of entire herds dying in nearby counties, Thorne's ranch lost only a handful. 80% survived. The pasture was still. Dying, the wind was still dry. But inside the barn, the cattle breathed easier. Eliza finished her rounds and collapsed onto the hay. Her arms dusted in ash, sweat soaking through her bodice. Thorne stood, staring at her from the stable doorway. She looked up. "It's not luck," she whispered. "It's knowledge." He didn't say anything. Didn't ask why she had risked her health, her strength, her sleep. Instead, he stepped forward, and for the first time since Clara's funeral, he wrapped his arms around another human being. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It wasn't a careful one. It was the kind of embrace a man gives when he realizes the world has not stopped giving him things worth holding on to. Eliza didn't speak. She didn't have to. She just closed her eyes and let herself be held. By mid-August, the rain still had not come, but something else had begun to bloom. Eliza, once only seen as the cook, was now called on whenever someone twisted an ankle, came down with a fever, or burned a hand on the forge. She never turned anyone away. Her hands were steady, her voice sure. She taught simple remedies, using the herbs she had grown behind the cattle pens. Soon, ranchers from all over the panhandle were whispering about a place up north where a woman could cure the sick, where even cattle stood taller after nearly dying. The McCrae Ranch, they said. The one where the baby is always smiling and the food doesn't taste like gunpowder. One day, as Thorne was mending a fence, Eliza approached. Leo was toddling beside her, holding onto her skirt. "Are you building another corral?" she asked, shielding her eyes from the sun. Thorne drove another nail before answering. "No." He stood up, wiping sweat from his brow. He pointed to a new wooden frame being erected next to the kitchen. "That's for you." Her breath caught. A room, with its own door, new pine walls, and a bigger window facing east. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "But a woman needs her own space." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "I don't want you thinking you have to leave when winter ends." "I never thought that," she whispered. "Good," he said, and turned back to his work. But between the hammer blows, a silent question had been asked, and an answer had been accepted. They arrived in a fine-covered wagon, dressed not in dust and sweat like most ranchers, but in tailored vests and slit boots that had never touched manure. 4 of them, clean-shaven, their eyes sharp with calculation, their smiles too smooth. Thorne met them at the gate. "We heard," the one in front said, tipping his hat, "that your ranch has something special." Thorne crossed his arms. "We sell beef, not fairy tales," the man chuckled. "Heard you've got a lady here, one who heals. One who knows how to mix herbs, soothe a man's pains, calm his nerves. That right?" Thorne's face went still. "Are you here to buy cattle or not?" The man stepped closer. "We own a fine establishment in Amarillo. Could use someone with her touch. We'd pay well. Room and board. She wouldn't be mistreated. In fact, some of our clientele are quite influential." "I see," Thorne nodded once. Then he punched the man square in the jaw. He hit the ground like a sack of feed. The others reached for their weapons, but Thorne already had his rifle up, cold and steady. "Get off my land," he growled, "before I forget I'm a peaceful man." They left, but they didn't forget. 3 nights later, the ranch was asleep beneath a silver moon, the air thick with the song of crickets. Eliza lay in her new room, Leo asleep in the cradle beside her. She awoke to silence, too much silence. Then, the creak of a floorboard. She sat up, her heart pounding. The cradle was empty. The window was open. She screamed. Thorne bolted from his bed. In under a minute, they were on horseback, a lantern swinging from his saddle horn, Eliza clutching her herb pouch, rage and terror burning brighter than any flame. They rode hard into the mesquite thicket, following hoofprints and broken branches. Thorne tracked like a wolf, no hesitation, no doubt. They found them by a creek bend. The same men, hunched around a fire, laughing low. One was holding the baby, wrapped in his jacket. "Give him back," Eliza said, her voice like a blade. The leaders sneered. "You should have come with us, sweetheart. Now you'll come anyway, without your pride." Thorne fired a single shot into the dirt. "Let the boy go." The man lunged instead, dragging Leo toward the fire. Eliza moved without thinking. She reached into her pouch and threw a handful of powder-burned bark and dried leaf ash straight into the man's eyes. He screamed, clutching his face, stumbling blindly. She grabbed Leo, her heart nearly bursting, and ran for Thorne. The others backed away. Thorne held her close as she pressed the child to her chest, sobbing, rocking, whispering his name over and over. The men vanished into the night. The danger had passed. Thorne said nothing. He only walked over, knelt beside them, and pressed a long, quiet kiss to Leo's forehead. Then he placed the baby gently back into Eliza's trembling arms and sat beside her until the sun began to rise. Evening came softly across the Texas panhandle, painting gold across the fields that were no longer grassless. The great oak tree behind the house, older than the ranch, perhaps older than memory, stood silent, its branches creaking in the wind like a voice remembering a song. Thorne McCrae sat beneath it, his back against its weathered bark, cradling the old guitar in his lap. He hadn't played in weeks, not since the night in the barn when Eliza reminded him that music was a kind of prayer. Now his fingers moved. Slowly, gently, plucking out the tune that Clara had once written, a melody that never had words, but had always had a heart. The notes drifted across the yard, curling like smoke through the open windows of the kitchen, where Eliza was peeling apples. She stepped outside, barefoot, quiet as dusk, and watched from the porch. She did not speak. He looked up at her once, then back to the strings, finishing the tune with a sigh that wasn't quite sadness. "I used to think that song belonged to the past," he said finally. "But it doesn't, not anymore." Eliza stepped down and walked toward him, her shawl fluttering in the breeze, her hands stained with cinnamon and flour. She sat across from him on the dry grass. "I thought I'd never hear you play again," she said. He shrugged. "I thought I'd never want to." He set the guitar aside, the silence settling around them like a warm blanket. "Eliza," he said slowly, "I'm not asking this because I think I need a woman around the house. Lord knows you're not just a woman around the house." She raised a brow. "I'm asking," he continued, "because I've known two kinds of silence in my life. The kind that kills you and the kind that heals you. And ever since you showed up with a baby on your hip and herbal tea in your hands, it's been the healing kind." Her eyes glistened. "I'm not good with words. I don't have a ring. But I don't want to live another sunrise without knowing. You're just a room away." She laughed, a quiet, tearful, trembling sound. "I came here begging for food," she whispered. "Begging to be allowed to stay. Now you're asking me to stay forever." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm asking you to be my home." She cupped his face, her voice breaking. "It seems there really is a spring after the coldest March." They married 3 days later. There was no preacher, no church bells, no lace or silver or choir. Only the oak tree, its limbs high and wide like arms open to bless them. The men strung up lanterns between fence posts. Jed roasted a whole hog. Finn, fully recovered, played the harmonica with all the grace of a jackrabbit in a hailstorm, but no one minded. Baby Leo wore a crown of wildflowers and giggled through the entire ceremony. Eliza wore a cloak the color of mint leaves, soft and clean. Her hair was braided with ribbon, and she walked down the path between hay bales barefoot, hand in hand with Thorne. When she reached him, she said only, "Took you long enough, cowboy." He smiled like a man reborn. They exchanged vows without paper or ink. No one signed a thing, but everyone there knew it was real. In the weeks that followed, Thorne carved a new sign for the front gate. He sanded it smooth, burned the letters in by hand, and hung it beneath the old ranch name, McCrae and Rose Ranch, a homestead of Achope. The sun hung low when he finished, lighting the letters like fire. Inside the house, Eliza was rocking Leo, who was now taking short, proud steps across the floor, his chubby fists clutching anything he could grab. The boy babbled endlessly, the sound of a life too full to be quiet. Thorne stepped inside, wiped his hands on his jeans, and crossed to where Eliza stood. They watched the child together. Then he reached for her hand, linked their fingers, and whispered. Spring came late, but it came. Outside, the wind swept softly across the yard, through the herb garden now blooming wild, over the fields beginning to heal, and beneath the great oak where a guitar once sang to ghosts, now sat only silence, the good kind.